She was 8 months pregnant when he made her kneel, not to a god, not to an enemy, to a woman who had been sleeping in the bed Leora had warmed for 6 years. The Alpha of Silver Ridge stood in front of his entire council, looked his mate in the eye, and said the words that would unravel everything he had ever built, quietly, cleanly, like a man who had rehearsed it so many times it no longer hurt him to say. It hurt everyone else. If you've ever loved someone who turned that love into a weapon against you, stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. Let's walk this road together. Walk. Part 1. A humiliation no Luna should endure. The morning it happened, the sky over Silver Ridge came in the color of a bruise. Leora noticed it through the narrow window above the wash basin, that particular purple-gray pressing low against the tree line like something heavy was sitting on the horizon deciding whether or not to fall. She had learned to read mornings by now. 8 months of reading them, waking before dawn to feel the weight of the child shifting inside her, cataloging the small signs, the quality of light, the stillness of the hall, whether she could hear boots on the floor above, trying to know in advance what kind of day she was walking into. She had learned that information early was the only advantage she had left in this house. She splashed cold water on her face and gripped the basin's edge until the knuckles went pale. The baby moved, a long, slow roll, unhurried, like it had all the time in the world. She pressed one hand flat against the underside of her belly, feeling the shape of a heel or an elbow pushing back against her palm with a quiet, insistent pressure that said, "I'm here. Whatever else, I'm here." "I know," she said out loud to no one. "I know you are." She dressed carefully, not the way she used to dress for council days, pulling on the blue-gray of a Luna's formal colors with the kind of automatic confidence that came from years of unquestioned standing, but the way a soldier dresses before a march she already knows will be brutal. Slow, deliberate, checking every fastening twice. The clothes were practical, nothing ornamented, because the child made ornamentation impossible, and because somewhere over the past 4 months, Leora had stopped caring what she looked like in front of Kaylin and had started caring only about what she was able to do. There was a difference between those two things, and it was one she had learned at cost. The hall outside her chamber was quiet when she opened the door. The quiet itself had a texture now. It wasn't the quiet of a house sleeping, it was the quiet of a house that had already decided where its loyalties lay and didn't feel the need to announce it. Servants moved past her with their eyes down. 2 of Kaylin's warriors stood at the end of the corridor near the council room, and they straightened when they saw her but didn't speak, and she walked past them without asking for anything because asking had stopped yielding answers 3 months ago. She heard Celine's voice before she reached the hall. She always heard Celine's voice before she reached anywhere anymore. The woman had a particular quality to her presence. Not loud exactly, but penetrating, the way a high note penetrates even when it isn't being sung full-throated. The voice carried the casual authority of someone who has decided that a space belongs to her and is only waiting for everyone else to arrive at the same conclusion. Leora stopped just outside the entrance to the main hall and stood with her hand on the doorframe, listening. "The report from the eastern border needs to be redrawn," Celine was saying. "I've already spoken with Elder Harwick about the boundary markers. If we're going to present this to the outer territories at the assembly, it needs to look unified from the start." One of the council members answered. Leora recognized Davon's flat, cautious tone. "That's typically a matter the Luna reviews before it goes to Elder Harwick." "And the Luna is indisposed," Celine said. "She's been indisposed for months. We're not going to stall the pack's business indefinitely." A pause. Then, "Of course." Leora let out a breath through her teeth. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter and colder than rage. She had been watching this particular erosion happen in increments for months, and each time she named it to herself, she used smaller words. Less dramatic language. Because the dramatic language made it feel like something she should be actively fighting, and fighting openly, right now, was not something she could afford. Not with 8 months of child inside her. Not until she had what she needed. She pushed the door open and walked in. The hall was built to be imposing. The original Alpha of Silver Ridge, Kaylin's grandfather, had designed it that way deliberately. High ceilings, exposed timber, stone walls that held the cold even in summer so that anyone standing in the center of the room felt exposed and small. Leora had spent 6 years at the center of this room and had learned to stand in it like she belonged there, which she still did, regardless of what anyone else was currently deciding. Celine was standing near the head of the council table. She was dressed in soft ivory, not quite the Luna's blue-gray, not quite not either, a careful, calculated somewhere between, and she turned when Leora entered with a smile that was so precisely calibrated it almost passed for the real thing. Almost. Leora. The name in Celine's mouth landed like a stone into still water. We weren't expecting you this morning. I expect that's why I'm here, Leora said. She looked at the faces around the table. Davin, who wouldn't hold her eyes. Corin, who was studying the grain of the wood. Elder Harwick, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. 3 junior council members she had appointed herself, 18 months ago, before everything had started to come apart. She pulled out her chair at the left of the head and sat down in it with the deliberate economy of movement that 8 months required and that she refused to allow to look like difficulty. The Eastern Boundary Report, she said. I'll review it before it goes to Harwick. Celine said, lightly, pleasantly, I think that's been handled. I know you do, Leora said. Hand me the report. A silence. Not the comfortable silence of a question waiting for an answer, but the loaded silence of a room watching 2 forces press against each other and waiting to see which one gives. The door at the far end of the hall opened and Kalen walked in. He was a big man. That had always been true, before it stopped being a comfort. Wide through the shoulders, carrying his authority the way he carried his height, like something he'd been born to and had never thought to question. He had dark hair that he kept short, jaw that hadn't been shaved in 2 or 3 days, and the kind of physical presence that a room rearranged itself around whether anyone intended that or not. For 6 years, that presence had been something Leora moved toward. In the last 4 months, she had been learning to move through it instead of toward it, the same way you learn to move through a current that wants to pull you sideways. He looked at Celine first. That was the tell. It was always the tell now. The half-second of recalibration when he walked into a room, the eyes moving first to wherever Celine was standing, the small, involuntary shift of posture before anything else registered. Leora had stopped waiting to be the first thing he looked for. That particular waiting had exhausted her around the 5th month, and she had let it go like dropping something she'd been carrying too long. Then he looked at Leora. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, not exactly, more like the expression of a man who has made a decision he believes is right and finds the living evidence of a former choice inconvenient. You didn't need to come in today, he said. His voice was even, not unkind, which was almost worse. The Eastern report needed reviewing, Leora said. I'm reviewing it. I told Celine to take point on that. I'm the Luna of Silver Ridge, Leora said, and she kept her voice at exactly the same temperature he'd kept his. No heat in it, no pleading, just the fact, set down like a stone on a table. The boundary report goes through me. That's how it's always worked. That's how it should still work. Kalen crossed to the head of the table. Celine shifted slightly, making room for him, the movement so practiced it barely looked like movement at all. He sat down in the Alpha's chair and put both hands flat on the table and looked at his Luna across the length of it. Things have changed, he said. They haven't changed that much, she said. The room was holding its breath. Leora could feel it, the tight collective suspension of a dozen people waiting to see how far this was going to go before they needed to pick a side. She had watched them all doing the same calculation for months. Kalen is the alpha, Celine has his ear, Leora has seniority and right, but seniority and right are worth less every week. Which way does the leverage fall if this comes to a head? She let the silence hold exactly as long as she needed to, then reached across the table and took the Eastern Boundary Report from in front of Elder Harwick and opened it and began to read. Kalen let her. That was how it ended that particular morning, not with a confrontation, but with him watching her read and not stopping her, and Celine watching him watch her with those calibrated gray eyes that never gave away anything except the fact that something was always calculating behind them. Leora read the report, It had been altered. She noted 3 specific boundary descriptions that had been changed from the original document she'd signed off on in the 4th month of her pregnancy, subtle enough to escape a quick review, significant enough to matter. She said nothing about it at the table. She asked for a copy for her records, which was routine, which couldn't be refused without creating visible cause for alarm, and Elder Harwick gave it to her with the slightly hunched posture of a man who knows he has done something he shouldn't and is hoping he isn't going to be the one who has to account for it. She walked out of the hall with the altered report folded inside her vest, and the child moving steadily against her ribs, and 2 more pieces of something she was assembling with great patience, in the dark, like a woman building a case. It was the summons that ended the quiet. Leora was in the secondary archive room, a narrow, cold, book-smelling room on the lower level that nobody particularly wanted to be in, and that she had consequently found extremely useful over the past month, when the runner arrived. A boy, young, keeping his eyes at his boots in the way of someone who has been told to deliver a message and not react to whatever happens when he delivers it. "The Alpha calls the full council to the main hall," the boy said. "Every council seat, all senior warriors, all pack elders." A pause. "He asks that you attend as well." Leora looked at him across the stack of documents she'd been cataloging. "He asks." The boy swallowed. Those were the words he used. She studied the boy for a moment. The tension at his jaw, the way he was working very hard at stillness. He was maybe 16, one of the younger runners Davin used for errands he didn't want to trust to anyone older. His face said he knew he was carrying something heavy and didn't want any of it to land on him. "What time?" she asked. 1 hour, he said. He said there is an announcement." Leora set the documents down with deliberate care, aligning the edges. The baby turned inside her, a long, slow movement, the heel tracking across her lower abdomen. She breathed through it. "Go on," she told the boy. "I'll be there." She spent the hour finishing her cataloging. Not in defiance, not in delay, because the work needed doing and because she was going to need the contents of those records regardless of what happened in the main hall in 1 hour, and because keeping her hands busy was the closest thing she had to keeping her head clear. When she was finished, she stacked everything in the cedar box she kept in the false-bottomed storage unit behind the south shelving, locked it twice, and put the key where she always put it. Then she washed her hands and went upstairs. The main hall was full in a way it hadn't been since the midwinter reckoning 3 years ago, when the border dispute with Ironvale had pulled every ranked member of Silver Ridge into one room for 7 hours of grinding negotiation. Leora remembered standing at Kaylin's left through all of it, the 2 of them presenting a single front against an opposing pack that had been probing for weakness. And when it was over and they had held every inch of the territory they'd come in defending, Kaylin had looked at her in the hall outside and said, "I don't want to do that without you." And she had understood him to mean it. That had been 3 years ago. She stood now at the left edge of the room and looked at the assembled council. Every face she knew, every rank represented, and Celine standing at Kaylin's right with the ivory of her dress catching the firelight. The hall smelled of wood smoke and cold stone, and the particular tense, crowded smell of too many people in an enclosed space waiting for something they already half know is coming. Kaylin was at the head. He had changed from the morning, dressed now in the formal dark of Alpha ceremony colors, and something about that formal dress in the middle of an ordinary Thursday made the back of Leora's neck go tight. He looked at her when she entered. She looked back at him. She kept her face neutral because neutral was the only thing she could afford right now, and because she had promised herself months ago that, whatever happened in front of this room, she would not give him or anyone else the gift of her disintegration. She moved to her seat. Celine's eyes tracked her with the bright, professional attention of a bird watching something move at the periphery of its territorial range. Kaylin raised one hand and the room went quiet. "Silver Ridge has always been a pack that acts with clarity," he said. His voice filled the hall the way it always did. Clean, direct, built for rooms like this one. "We don't drift. We don't accommodate weakness in our own structure and call it loyalty. We make decisions that serve the pack's future even when those decisions are hard." He had rehearsed this. Leora recognized the slightly formal cadence of it, not the way he spoke when he was thinking on his feet, which was sharper and more jagged and occasionally brilliant, but the smoothed-out language of a man who wrote something down and then worked out how to sound like he hadn't. She had heard him rehearse speeches before, had helped him with some of them. Going forward, he said, Silver Ridge needs a Luna who can serve without interruption, who carries the work of this pack without compromise. He looked down the table. Celine Voss has demonstrated, over the past several months, the qualities this pack needs in that role. Today I am formally proposing her as the next Luna of Silver Ridge. The word next landed in the room like a held breath. Not new, not additional. Next. Beside Leora, Elder Koshia's hand moved to the table. Very small movement, the kind old women make when they are deciding something. Kaelin wasn't finished. In preparation for this transition, I'm asking that all lunar duties currently assigned be transferred to Celine immediately, pending full council confirmation at the assembly. Leora heard the word immediately and felt something close inside her chest with a sound like a door. She looked at Celine. Celine was looking at the middle distance, composed, the expression of a woman receiving something she had long since determined she deserved. She looked at Kaelin. He was looking at the table. He was not looking at her. Kaelin. She said his name and the room went quieter in a way that rooms do when the person who has the least to say finally decides to say something. Look at me. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. She couldn't name it and didn't try, because the time when reading his face was useful information had already passed. You're doing this now, she said. Not a question. With 8 weeks left. The timing is what it is, he said. The Pax needs... You're standing in front of your full council, she said, and her voice was steady, and she was grateful for every month she'd spent learning how to keep it that way, and proposing to replace me 8 weeks before I give birth to your child. I want to be clear about what's happening here. I want every person in this room to be clear. A silence. Long enough to mean something. Then, from behind Celine, a woman's voice, smooth, angled, perfectly timed. The child's parentage doesn't obligate the Pack's leadership structure. Leora turned and looked at the woman who'd spoken. One of Celine's cluster. Maret, the one with the copper hair who had recently been given an advisory seat, nobody remembered voting to create. She said it with the confidence of someone who had been told she would not be contradicted. Nobody asked you, Leora said. Marit's eyes went slightly wide. Nobody spoke. Leora looked back at Kaelin. I want to hear you say it, she said. Not through her, not through anyone. You look at me and you tell me what you're actually proposing. Kaelin's jaw tightened. I just told this room, you told this room a lot of polished language about clarity and the Pack's future, Leora said. Tell me what you mean. While I'm standing here carrying your air, tell me what you mean. A muscle jumped under his left eye. He looked like a man being asked to walk out of a house he has already set on fire. You're being relieved of your duties, he said. The assembly will formalize Celine's appointment. Your position in this pack will be clarified at that time. My position, she said. Yes, will be clarified. Leora, say the word, she said. Whatever you mean, say the actual word. He said nothing. And in his silence, Celine stepped forward and filled it with the practiced ease of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this gap. Leora, Celine said, and the warmth in it was extraordinary, the precise warmth of someone performing warmth for an audience. Nobody is trying to humiliate you. This is a practical matter. You've been struggling with your duties for months. Everyone can see it. The pack needs continuity. You don't get to speak to me directly, Leora said without looking at her, a collective intake of breath. Celine smiled, not the performance of warmth, something harder underneath it. You'll want to be careful about that tone. I'll want to be careful, Leora repeated, and she finally looked at Celine, all the way, without the buffer of peripheral attention she'd been giving her for months. She looked at Celine the way she looked at the altered documents in the archive room, straight at the revision marks, straight at the thing that had been changed. That's interesting. The moment held like something balanced on an edge. Then Kaelin's voice finally cracking through it. Enough! He stood, chair back, full height, the Alpha's physical authority filling the room with the kind of unconscious totality that Leora had once found reassuring. "This is not a debate," he said. "The decision is made. The transition will proceed." He looked at her, and in his face she could see it. Not cruelty exactly, something smaller and more terrible, which was the face of a man who had already convinced himself he was doing the right thing and needed only to get through the next 30 seconds to be free of her disagreement. "I'm asking you, for the sake of this pack, to let this proceed with dignity." She looked at him for a long time. "Dignity," she said. "That's the word you're using." She looked around the room. At Davon, who had served this pack for 22 years and was staring at his hands. At Elder Cassia, who was watching her with something in her face that might have been an apology. At the warriors she had sat beside during border negotiations and disciplinary hearings, and 3 separate crises over the last 6 years, most of whom were currently finding the middle distance very interesting. At Celine, who was watching all of it with the patient expression of a woman counting something. Leora put her hand on the table. Flat, like Kaylin had done that morning. She pushed herself to her feet with the deliberate, careful motion that 8 months required, and that she allowed now without pretending it wasn't difficult, because this particular room had seen everything else, and there was nothing left to conceal from it. She stood up straight. "I'll tell you what I'm going to do," she said, and the room went very still. "I'm going to walk out of this hall, and I'm going to take care of my child, and I'm going to wait. I'm good at waiting." Her eyes moved to Celine. "And when the assembly comes, when you stand in front of every pack leader in the territory and make your oath, I'll be there." She picked up the council ledger that sat in front of her place. Her ledger, her handwriting in it from 6 years of session records, and tucked it under her arm. "Every piece of this has been documented," she said, to no one in particular, to everyone. "Everything that has been done in this hall for the last 8 months. I want that known." She walked to the door. Behind her, Kaylin's voice. "Leora." She stopped, didn't turn. "This doesn't have to—" "Yes, it does," she said. "You made sure of that." She walked out. The corridor outside the main hall was empty. She stood in it for a moment with her back against the cold stone and the council ledger pressed to her chest, and the child sitting heavy and low inside her, and she breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. 3 times, 4, until the ringing in her ears started to clear. She had known this was coming. She had felt it building for weeks, the pressure of it gathering like weather, and she had spent that time doing what she could do. Documenting, copying, collecting the small pieces of evidence that Celine's machinery had left behind in its confidence, the way large machines always do, shavings and discards, and the small marks of having been somewhere that the machine itself never thinks to clean up. She had 3 altered reports. She had copies of 2 letters that shouldn't exist. She had the testimony of a border warrior named Evan, who had been told, explicitly told, to file false accounts of the Luna's interactions with the Eastern Patrol, and who had come to Leora in the 3rd month with the shaking hands of a man who cannot reconcile what he's been asked to do with what he actually is, and she had been patient with him and thanked him and asked him only to be willing to repeat it when the time came. She had been building something, in the dark, with great care. She was not ready yet. The assembly was 3 weeks out. 3 weeks was, if she was careful, just enough. She straightened off the wall and started walking. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard the hall doors open behind her and a voice called her name. Not Kaylin, not Celine, but Marae's voice, the copper-haired woman, and the sound of it made Leora stop in spite of herself because the tone was wrong, too bright, too sharp. The sound of someone given a task they are enjoying. "The Alpha Consort wants a word," Maret said, and she used the title, Alpha Consort, not Luna, not Celine, but the formal title for what Celine would become, in a voice that was designed to land like a demonstration. "Before you go, there's something you're expected to do." Leora turned slowly. Marae was standing in the corridor with 2 warriors flanking her at a distance. The distance was carefully calculated to not look like a blockade while being exactly a blockade. Leora looked at her. "What did you say?" "The Alpha Consort is with guests," Maret said. "The delegation from the Thornwood Alliance arrived this morning. They've been waiting in the reception room." A pause that contained everything it needed to. "The consort would like you to attend." "To attend what?" Leora said. Marit looked at her with the flat, serene expression of a woman delivering a message she has been told twice to make sure is delivered. She arrived this morning from a long journey. She needs to be received. Another pause. And she has a particular request about her feet after the travel. The corridor was very quiet. Leora stood in it and let the full meaning of those words arrive. She felt the child move. Sudden, a shudder of motion across her belly that wasn't quite distress and wasn't quite comfort, just life, insisting on itself in the middle of something that wanted to make her forget it. She had been carrying this child for 8 months. She had held every piece of her dignity through every piece of what had been done to her. She had not cried in front of a single person in this pack since the 3rd month, when she had understood what was happening and had gone alone to the eastern meadow at 4 a.m. and stood in the wet grass and let it out in the dark, where nobody could see it, and then come back and bend the Luna because that was what the situation required. She looked at Marais. She looked at the 2 warriors flanking her, both of them very still, neither of them looking at her face. "No," Leora said. Marit's expression shifted very slightly. "I don't think you—" "No," Leora said again, and her voice was quiet and absolute, and she stood in it like a woman standing on ground she has decided she will not move from. "Go back and tell whoever sent you that the answer is no, that the answer will always be no, and that if this request is ever communicated to me again through any channel by any person, I will stand in the center of this hall and I will say everything I know in front of every person I can gather." She looked at Marais with the clear, level attention of someone who has nothing left to protect except the thing that matters. "Try it and find out." She turned and walked away. Behind her, she heard Marais exhale, heard a murmured exchange between her and the warriors, heard nothing follow. She walked to the end of the corridor and turned the corner into the secondary passage that led to the lower archive room, and she stood in it in the dark with the smell of cold stone and old paper around her, and she opened the cedar box, and she checked that what was inside was still there, the altered reports, the letters. The affidavit Yvonne had given her in the 3rd month, written in his own hand because she had told him that his own handwriting mattered. She added the council ledger she was carrying. She locked the box twice. And then she pressed both hands flat against the archive room wall, and she put her forehead against the stone, and she said very quietly to the child inside her, 8 weeks. Just give me 8 weeks. She pushed off the wall. She picked up a clean ledger from the supply shelf. She carried it back upstairs under her arm. But in the main hall, behind the council room's thick door, Celine was pulling Kaylin's hand toward her across the table, and Kaylin was letting her, and Marrow was already at the room's edge, speaking quietly into Elder Harwick's ear. There was a letter arriving by fast runner from the outer territories, a letter that bore the seal of Silver Ridge's oldest treaty ally. And it was not addressed to the Alpha. It was addressed to the Luna, and its contents, had anyone known what they contained, would have changed everything about the calculation Celine believed she had already won. Because the person who had written it knew something that Celine, for all her machinery, had not managed to intercept. Something that Leora had done 4 months ago, quietly, without telling anyone, at the end of a night when she had stopped grieving what was being taken from her, and had started asking what she could still build. The runner was at the outer gate. He was asking for the Luna of Silver Ridge by name. The runner's name was Kyle. He was maybe 20, travel dusty, with the lean, road-worn look of someone who had covered ground fast and eaten little doing it. He stood at the outer gate with the letter held against his chest in both hands, like he'd been told specifically not to let it out of his grip, until he put it in the right hands. And when Leora came through the gate toward him, he looked at her face and then at her belly, and some quick internal calculation crossed his expression before he straightened and said, "Luna of Silver Ridge." Not a question, a confirmation. "Yes," she said. He extended the letter. She took it, broke the seal. The pressed wax bore the sigil of the Greyvale Compact, the oldest treaty alliance in the Northern Territory, a body that had not communicated directly with Silver Ridge in over 2 years, and read it standing in the open air with the gate at her back and the cold coming off the tree line. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original crease and put it inside her vest, against the altered boundary reports, and said to Cale, "How long did it take you?" 4 days, he said. The The compact's head archivist said it needed to reach you before the assembly. It did, she said. Come inside. You need food and a bed. My instructions were to wait for a reply. Your reply will be ready in the morning, she said. Come inside. She brought him through the servants' entrance, not the main gate, because she was not ready yet for anyone inside this hall to know that a courier from the Greyville Compact had arrived asking for the Luna by name. She settled him in one of the lower guest rooms with food from the kitchen and strict instruction to no one in particular, a kitchen girl who would not carry word to anyone who mattered, that the traveler was to be left to rest. Then she went back to the archive room and locked the door. She spread the letter on the table beside the cedar box and read it a third time. The Greyville Compact's head archivist, a woman named Solney, who Leora had met exactly once 3 years ago at a territory convening, and had spent 40 minutes talking to in the corridor outside the formal session about the practical failures of boundary arbitration, had written not in formal treaty language, but in the plain, pointed register of someone who believes the person they are writing to is capable of handling direct information. The letter said that the Compact had received, over the past 3 months, 3 separate approaches from a representative of Silver Ridge, requesting that the Compact formally recognize a new Luna claimant ahead of the assembly. The approaches had been made not through the Alpha's office, not through the council, but through a private intermediary. The Compact had declined all 3 approaches because they were procedurally improper. The letter named the intermediary Marette, the copper-haired woman with the recently created advisory seat. Solney had added, in a postscript that was only 4 lines long and entirely without decoration. She was not sure who within Silver Ridge was conducting this campaign, but she wanted the Luna to have this information because the Compact considered Luna Leora's standing legitimate, and because what was being attempted, a pre-assembly recognition request through private back channels, was the kind of thing that, in her experience, happened when someone was not confident they could win a public process. Leora set the letter down. She sat with her hands flat on the table and the archive room's cold pressing in from all sides, and the child turning inside her with the patient rhythmic motion of something entirely unconcerned with what was happening outside it. 3 approaches. 3 months. Marette had been running a back channel to the Greyville Compact at the same time she was sitting in council sessions and delivering requests about foot washing on Celine's behalf, which meant Celine had known 3 months ago that the public process was not certain, which meant the confidence Celine wore like a second skin was, at least in part, constructed. Leora pressed her fingertips together. She thought about Evan's testimony. She thought about the altered boundary reports. She thought about the 2 letters, intercepted, copied, returned to their original position before anyone noticed, that sat in the cedar box in language that connected Celine's name to the falsified reports filed against Leora with the Eastern Patrol. She thought about the assembly, 3 weeks. She thought, not enough. Then she thought, it has to be. She began to write. The next morning came in cold and flat, the kind of morning that didn't bother building toward anything, just arrived gray and stayed gray. Leora was at the writing table in her chamber at first light. The reply to Solney drafted and redrafted twice until it was exactly what she needed it to be. Concise, specific, asking for one thing, explaining why that one thing was necessary without providing more context than the minimum required to get a yes. She was good at this kind of writing. She had been doing it for 6 years in service of this pack, and she had never been credited for it because it was the kind of work that only becomes visible when it stops being done. She sent Cale out through the servants' gate before the main hall woke up. She watched him go from the upper window and then turned back to the room and found Elder Cassia standing in the doorway. The old woman was small, had always been small, the kind of compact solidity that suggested she'd spent decades distilling herself down to what was absolutely essential. She had silver-white hair pinned close to her head and dark eyes that had been watching things in Silver Ridge for longer than Leora had been alive, and she was looking at Leora now with the expression of a woman who has decided to say something she has been holding for a while. "Come in or don't," Leora said. Cassia came in. She closed the door. She did not sit down. "Yesterday," the elder said, "what he did. I know what he did. I want you to know I didn't vote for it. I know that too, Leora said. You didn't speak against it either. Kassia's jaw tightened. It was not the response of a woman who didn't know she deserved the observation. There are things in motion that I don't fully understand, she said. That I should understand and don't. That's a failure on my part. Yes, Leora said, not cruelly, just accurately. Can you tell me what you know? Leora looked at the old woman for a long moment. She thought about what to give and what to keep and where the line was between an ally who could be useful and a witness who could be pressured. She thought about the fact that Kassia had 22 years of institutional standing in this pack, and that her voice in a full assembly carried weight that 3 junior council seats combined could not match. She thought about Avon's shaking hands, about the way trust worked when it was real, like a door you open knowing it might not close again. Sit down, she said. Kassia sat. I'm going to tell you some of what I know, Leora said. Not all of it. What I tell you, I need you to be able to swear to in front of the full assembly if it comes to that. Can you do that? If I believe it, Kassia said. You'll believe it, Leora said. The question is whether you're willing to say it out loud with Kaylin in the room. Kassia's dark eyes held steady. Tell me what you know, she said. Then I'll tell you what I'll do. It was the most honest answer Leora had gotten from anyone inside this hall in 4 months. She recognized it for what it was, and she gave the elder what she had decided to give. Not the letters, not yet, but the boundary reports and the shape of what Yvonne had told her, enough to let a 22-year elder draw the lines herself, enough to let the picture form from the inside so that Kassia's belief in it was her own. The old woman listened without speaking. She sat with her hands in her lap and her face very still, and she listened the way people listen when they are not waiting to respond but waiting to understand. When Leora finished, Kassia was quiet for a moment. She moved fast, the elder said finally. She'd been moving for longer than any of us saw, Leora said. And Kaylin? Kaylin believed what he was given, Leora said, and she was surprised at how level her own voice stayed around his name. That's a different problem from knowing, but it doesn't make the damage different. Kassia nodded, slow, the nod of a woman recalibrating something structural. The assembly, she said. 3 weeks, Leora said. I'll be there, Kassia said. When you need me, I'll be there. She stood. At the door she paused without turning. You should eat something and sleep. The child needs it even if you don't. She left. Leora sat for a moment in the room's quiet. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. The approach came from Celine directly on the 5th day. Leora was crossing the inner courtyard, a route she used because it bypassed the main corridor where Celine spent most of her visible hours, which was not avoidance so much as efficient use of territory, when the woman appeared from the eastern archway with the specific timing of someone who had known exactly which route to wait on. 2 of Celine's cluster were with her at a distance. Leora kept walking, and Celine fell into step beside her with the fluid ease of a woman completely comfortable occupying another person's space. I've been wanting to talk to you, Celine said. I know, Leora said. She did not slow down. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Which part? All of it, Celine said pleasantly. The resistance, the gathering of whatever you think you're gathering. She glanced at Leora sideways, the angled look of someone checking a peripheral reading. People talk. You've been in that archive room a great deal. I like the quiet, Leora said. Leora. The name in Celine's voice now had something beneath the warmth, a slight downward pressure, like a hand placed on a shoulder that hasn't asked to be touched. What you're hoping to do, it isn't going to work. The assembly is a formality. The decision is already made. I'm asking you, genuinely, to think about what the next year of your life looks like if you spend it fighting something that's already been decided. Leora stopped walking. She turned and looked at Celine. Straight at her, all the way, the same way she'd done in the hall, stripping out the buffer of peripheral attention and looking at the actual woman, at the architecture of what was happening behind the gray eyes. She had learned in the past months that Celine was most readable not when she was performing warmth, but in the half second after she was done performing it, when the face briefly returned to its resting configuration. That resting configuration was extremely controlled. It told Leora everything she needed to know. "What do you want?" Leora said. Celine's expression shifted slightly. The warmth recalibrated. "I want this to go smoothly." "You want me to leave before the assembly?" "I want you to consider what's best for your child," Celine said. "An infant doesn't need to enter this world in the middle of a pack conflict. That's not good for anyone." The child moved inside her at that exact moment. Not symbolically, just biologically. The random internal motion of a being at 8 months that happened to coincide with a sentence about it. Leora felt the heel track across her lower ribs, and she breathed through it and kept her face where it was. "What did you tell the Eastern Patrol?" she said. Celine's expression didn't change. That was the tell. Not a flinch, not a flicker, but the total absence of surprise, the face of a woman who had already prepared for this question and was now deploying the preparation. "I don't know what you mean," Celine said. "Evan Cray," Leora said. "Border warrior, 3rd Eastern rotation. He was told to file falsified contact reports about my interactions with the patrol. He was told by someone in this compound. I want to know if that someone was you or if you had a layer between you." A pause. The 2 cluster women at the archway had gone very still. "You're exhausted," Celine said. "You're carrying a child and you're under significant stress and you're—" "Look at my face," Leora said quietly, "and say that again." Celine looked at her face. Something moved through the gray eyes. Not fear, not guilt, but a species of calculation, the rapid internal adjustment of a chess player who has just seen a board configuration she hadn't fully accounted for. "The assembly will resolve everything," Celine said. Her voice had dropped the warmth entirely now. What was underneath it was flat and certain and harder than Leora had ever heard her sound. "Whatever you think you have, I'd think carefully about whether it's enough. And I'd think carefully about what happens to the people around you if you're wrong. The people around you, Evan, Kasia, the kitchen girl who'd brought Kale food without asking questions." Leora held Celine's gaze for 3 full seconds. "Thank you," she said. "That's exactly what I needed to know." She turned and walked away. Behind her, Celine's voice one final time, very quiet, aimed at her back. "Don't misunderstand what I'm offering." Leora kept walking and did not answer, because the thing Celine had just done, naming the people around her, floating the word wrong, the subtle architecture of a threat framed as advice, had told her something that no amount of archival work could have confirmed. Celine was not certain. Celine had found the edge of what she'd built, and was looking over it and had decided the best move was to apply pressure before the assembly rather than wait, which meant the assembly was still a live question, which meant there was still something to win. Leora walked back to the archive room. She unlocked the cedar box and she took out the 2 letters, the ones she had intercepted and copied and returned, the ones that connected Celine's handwriting to specific instructions to specific people in a chain of falsification that the council would have to address directly if it was put in front of them. And she looked at them for a long time. Then she added the Greyvale letter to the stack. Then she added, below it, a new piece of paper. On this paper, she wrote 3 names, Evan Cray, Elder Kasia, and below those 2, a 3rd name, someone she had not yet contacted, someone who had been on the outer eastern border for the past 6 months, on an assignment that Leora had understood at the time as routine and now understood as removal. A warrior named Desta, who had been Leora's closest associate on the council for 4 years and who had been sent east by Kaelin 3 weeks after Celine's influence had first made itself visible, on the basis of a border security review that Leora now suspected had been manufactured. She had not reached out to Desta. She had been waiting, because reaching out carried risk, because any communication could be intercepted, because every move she made needed to be exactly right and timed exactly right with the assembly as the fixed point everything had to land on. But Celine had just told her, in the flat, certain voice of a woman who believed she had already won, that the people around Leora were a liability, which meant Desta was already in her sights, which meant Leora was out of time to be cautious. She picked up a pen. She began to write a letter to the eastern border. She wrote fast, in the shorthand she and Desta had developed over 4 years of council work. Compact, undecorated, the kind of communication that looked like administrative correspondence to anyone who intercepted it and meant something else entirely to the person it was addressed to. She said, "I need you in Silver Ridge before the assembly. Don't announce it. Don't come through the main gate. There's a door at the south wall I will leave unlatched on the night of the 14th. Come to the archive room." She said, "Bring anything you have on the eastern border reassignment, every written order, every communication." She said at the end in plain language, "I know what's been done. I'm going to stand in front of the full assembly and say it out loud. I need you there." She folded the letter. She sealed it with nothing, no sigil, no wax, nothing that would identify its origin. She addressed it to a supply coordinator at the eastern outpost under a name only Desta would recognize, a shared reference from 3 years ago that existed nowhere in any official document. She set it on the table. Then she sat in the silence of the archive room, and she looked at what she had assembled over 8 months of carrying a child and a pack, and a loss so large she still hadn't found its edges. 3 reports, 2 letters, 1 compact communication, 1 witness prepared to speak, 1 elder prepared to stand, and now a letter traveling east to the only person left inside Silver Ridge's institutional structure who had not already made a choice. It was enough. It had to be enough. Because in 3 weeks the assembly would open, and Kaylin would stand in front of every allied pack leader in the territory and make an oath that could not be unmade, and the window between right now and that moment was the only window there was. She picked up the sealed letter. She went to find the one courier inside this compound she still trusted, a woman named Joss, who owed her nothing and therefore owed her everything, because the people who owe you nothing are the only ones whose help means what it says. Joss listened. Joss looked at the letter. Joss looked at Leora's face with the particular assessment of a woman deciding whether the thing she's being asked to do is worth the risk of the doing. She said, "When do you need it there?" 8 days, Leora said. Joss nodded once and took the letter and put it inside her vest and asked no further questions. Leora watched her walk out through the south corridor and disappear around the bend. She stood in the empty passage with her hand pressed to the curve of her belly and the cold of the stone floor coming up through her boots, and she thought, 6 weeks left. Give me 6 weeks. And then, from the level above her, the sound of Kaylin's voice. She could hear its resonance even through stone, even after everything, drifted down through the floor in a tone she recognized. Not the formal tone of counsel, not the careful tone he used around her now. The other one, the unguarded one, the one that used to be hers. She stood very still and she let herself hear it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked the other way. That night, after the compound had gone quiet and the hall lights had dimmed and the child had finally settled into the deep, slow rhythms of sleep, Leora sat at her writing table and opened a fresh ledger to its first page. At the top she wrote the date. Below it, in the clean, undecorated hand of a woman who had long since stopped writing for anyone's approval, she began to record everything. Every document, every conversation, every name, every date, the full shape of what had been done and who had done it, laid out in the order it would need to be presented to have its maximum force. She wrote for 3 hours. When she was done, she looked at what she had made and thought that it was either going to be enough to change everything, or it was going to be the thing they found when everything had already been lost, and that the difference between those 2 outcomes was whether Desta came through the south door on the night of the 14th. She closed the ledger. She set it in the cedar box with everything else. She locked it twice, put the key where she always put it, and sat for a moment in the dark. Then Desta's reply came. Not through Joss. Joss wasn't due back for days. Through a different channel entirely, a channel Leora had not opened, which meant Desta had found another way in, which meant something had happened at the eastern border that had pushed Desta towards Silver Ridge before the letter even arrived. The note was 3 lines. It said, "I've been trying to reach you for 2 weeks. I have the transfer order. I have more than the transfer order. I arrive in 2 days." And at the bottom, in the cramped, urgent handwriting of someone who had written it fast, "They know I've been asking questions. Someone told them. I need to move now." Leora read it. Read it again. She felt the cold of the stone room settle into her spine. She felt the child kick, sharp, sudden, the first genuinely forceful kick in days, and she pressed her palm flat against the place and held it there. Someone had told them. There was a line inside this compound that ran from Celine to someone who still had eyes on the eastern border. Someone who had known Desta was asking questions before Desta had even received Leora's letter. Someone inside the wall. She looked at the 3 names she had written on the fresh sheet of paper: Ivan, Kosya, Desta. And then she looked at the 4th name she had not written down yet because she had not wanted to write it, because writing it would mean it was real, because the person it belonged to had sat in Leora's council sessions for 2 years and had accepted her appointment with what had looked at the time like genuine gratitude. She picked up her pen. She wrote a 4th name below the other 3. She stared at it for a long time. Then she drew a line through it, not to erase it, but to mark it, the way you mark a thing you are going to have to deal with before you can deal with anything else. Desta was 2 days out and already compromised. The assembly was 3 weeks away. And somewhere inside Silver Ridge's walls, wearing the face of someone she had trusted, was the reason none of her careful work had stayed quiet. The 4th name on the paper was Davon. Leora sat with it for a long time in the archive room's dark. Davin, who had served Silver Ridge for 22 years. Devan, who had kept his eyes on his hands during the council announcement and whom she had read as shame. Devan, who had access to every outgoing communication from this compound, because routing internal correspondence was one of the 3 administrative functions his office controlled, and who had therefore had access to everything she'd sent and received for months, without her once considering him a vector. She had misread shame. She had looked at a man staring at his hands and seen guilt over inaction, and had not asked the next question, which was, guilt over what specific action? This was the thing about being wrong inside a system you had helped build. The wrongness had the texture of rightness. It felt like knowing. It felt like the accumulated weight of 6 years of correct reads, and so when the wrong read came, it wore the same clothes as all the right ones, and she had let it walk past her, and she had not looked back. She folded the paper with the 4 names. She put it in her vest, not the cedar box. The cedar box was documentation. This was something else. This was the map of the hole in her wall, and she needed to keep it close while she figured out what to do about it. Desta was 2 days out. 2 days was not enough time to build a new route for information in and out of this compound. It was barely enough time to warn Desta not to use the south door, which was now the only piece of her plan that she had communicated through a channel Davon controlled. She stood up too fast and caught the edge of the table, steadying herself against the head rush that came with it. The child shifted, that long rolling adjustment of a body resettling its weight, and she breathed through the pressure of it and stood straight and let her eyes adjust to the dark and thought. She could not send a warning through Joss. Joss had carried the original letter, and Devon would have that by now. She could not use any of the compound's standard courier routes. She needed someone outside the system entirely, someone with no administrative tie to this hall, no document trail, no reason to be watched. She thought of the kitchen girl who had brought Kale food without asking questions. A girl named Wren, maybe 17, who had been in Silver Ridge's service for less than a year and whose greatest administrative significance to anyone in this compound was that she knew how the bread schedule worked. Invisible. Completely invisible. Leora unlocked the archive room and went to find her. Wren was in the scullery at the back of the kitchen, cleaning pots with the methodical, half-absent focus of someone whose hands have done the same motion enough times that the mind can be somewhere else entirely. She looked up when Leora came in and immediately straightened, the reflex of a junior servant in the presence of rank, and Leora put one hand up to stop it. "Sit," she said. "I need to talk to you." Wren sat on the edge of the workbench and looked at Leora with the careful, watchful attention of a young person who has learned that when powerful people say they want to talk, it is generally about something that will affect you, whether you understand it or not. "I need you to carry a message," Leora said, "outside the compound, tonight, to a traveler on the Eastern Road. I can describe where they'll be camping. It's a specific location on the Greywash Fork, 2 days ride out, but you can reach it on horseback by early morning if you leave before midnight." Wren's eyes moved to Leora's belly. The calculation was instant and legible. The Luna is 8 months pregnant and asking a kitchen girl to do something that the compound's courier system apparently cannot do. "What's the message?" Wren said. "Change your approach. Come in from the north pasture gate, not the south wall. Wait at the haymaker's barn after dark on the 15th. Come alone." Wren looked at her for a moment. "That's all?" "That's all. You say it out loud, nothing written." "Who am I saying it to?" "A woman named Desta, traveling alone. She'll have a Silver Ridge Border Warriors kit. Worn, not formal. She won't be in colors. She'll know my name." Wren was quiet for another moment. She had stopped cleaning the pot. Her hands were still in her lap, and she was doing a very careful read of Leora's face, with the instinctive social intelligence of someone who has spent a year in a compound, watching the power structure shift and learning to survive in the current. "Is this going to make trouble for me?" Wren said. "Yes," Leora said. "If it goes wrong, yes. I won't lie to you about that." The girl nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "What if it goes right?" "If it goes right," Leora said, "I will remember who helped me." She did not dress it up. She did not promise specifics. She gave Wren the only currency that was actually worth anything in a pack on the edge of a power shift, the precise, unornamented fact of being seen by someone who might matter. Wren stood up and dried her hands on the work cloth. "I'll need a horse," she said. "South Stable, the gray. Tell them I authorized it. And if someone asks where I went—" "You had a family errand," Leora said. "You'll be back by morning." Wren nodded once and left. Leora stood in the empty scullery and listened to the sounds of the compound settling around her. The low fire, the distant movement of warriors on the night rotation, the creak of old timber. She thought about Davin. She thought about 22 years of service and what it cost, or what someone had offered that cost more. She thought about the particular exhaustion of discovering that the people who have the most to lose from betraying you are sometimes exactly the ones who do it, because they have the most detailed knowledge of where the gaps are. She went back upstairs and did not sleep. Davin came to her the next morning. She did not see him coming. He was simply in the corridor outside her chamber when she opened the door, standing with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in the expression she had misread as shame, which she now understood was something more complex and more specific. It was the face of a man in the middle of a calculation that hadn't resolved yet. She looked at him. "Leora," he said. His voice was quieter than usual, something careful in it. "Davan," she said, "I need to speak with you." "You're speaking," she said. She did not move from the doorway. He looked at the corridor in both directions. That look, checking for witnesses, was its own kind of answer. "Not here," he said. "Here or not at all," she said. "I'm not walking anywhere with you right now." His jaw worked. He looked at her face, and she watched him do it, watched him read whatever he found there and recalibrate against it. He had the look of a man who had prepared one conversation and was finding that the person he'd prepared it for had already moved past its terms. "I didn't know what she was going to do with it," he said. Low, fast, the compressed confession of someone who needs to be understood before they're condemned. "When she approached me, 3 months ago, 4, she said it was about ensuring continuity, keeping information flowing in the right direction. I didn't know she was running letters to the compact. I didn't know about the patrol reports." Leora looked at him. "What did you think you were doing?" He looked at the floor. "Managing the transition." "Managing the transition," she said, "while I was carrying his child." He said nothing. "What did she give you?" Leora said. A pause long enough to be its own answer. Then, assurance that my position would be secure under the new structure, my seat, my function. She said you were going to leave after the birth, that you'd already made arrangements to go back to your birth pack, that the transition was going to happen regardless, and she told you I was leaving, Leora said. She had letters, he said. She showed me letters with your seal. The forged letters. The ones Celine had used on Kaylin. Leora had known they existed. Yvonne had described them in the 3rd month, the campaign of fabricated evidence that had pushed Kaylin step by step toward the conclusion that his Luna had already emotionally abandoned the pack. But she had not known Celine had taken them to Devon as well, had not known the same letters had been used twice, on two different targets, each one believing they were the only person being shown proof. She looked at Devon, at the 22 years in his face, at the particular collapse of a man who has understood too late exactly what he participated in. "You routed Joss's letter," she said. His silence confirmed it. "And the reply from Desta." Another silence. Smaller. The silence of a man standing in the hole he's dug, seeing its full depth for the first time. "Celine has it," he said. "Both of them. She's known about Desta since yesterday morning." Leora felt the cold move through her chest. Not panic, something past panic, something on the other side of it. The specific clarity that arrives when the worst possible news turns out to be exactly as bad as you thought, and there is nothing left to brace against. "Then she knows about the South Wall," she said. "Yes." "And the assembly testimony?" He couldn't answer that. He didn't have to. Leora stood in her doorway and breathed. The child was still. Had been still for the last hour in the deep, suspended stillness that preceded movement, like something coiling before a stretch. She pressed one hand to her side and felt for the heartbeat she couldn't actually feel but had trained herself to imagine as present and steady because she needed it to be present and steady. "Get out of my corridor," she said. "Leora?" "I'm not going to tell you what I think of you," she said. "You already know. Get out of my corridor and don't approach me again before the assembly." He went. She closed the door. Celine moved that same afternoon. Not toward Leora. That was the intelligence of it. Celine had long since learned not to press Leora directly because direct pressure only compressed whatever Leora was building into a denser, harder form. She moved toward Evan instead. Leora found out through Kasia, who had heard it from a senior warrior who had been present when the summons went out. Evan Cray, border warrior, 3rd Eastern rotation, was called to an administrative hearing before a tribunal of 3, one of whom was Maret, one of whom was a warrior captain named Goss, who owed his rank to a promotion Celine had pushed for 2 months ago, and one of whom was nominally neutral but had the specific blankness of someone who has been told what the outcome needs to be. The charge was falsification of patrol reports. Leora read the summons that Kasia brought her and understood what she was looking at. Not a judicial proceeding, a preemption. Celine had seen what was coming at the assembly and had decided the cleanest way to neutralize Yvonne's testimony was to make him the accused rather than the witness. If the tribunal ruled against him, and with Maret and Goss sitting, it would, and the ruling would create an administrative record that named Yvonne as the source of the falsified reports, which would make his testimony about who had ordered them not a revelation, but a defensive maneuver from a man already convicted. It was elegant. It was brutal. It was the move of someone who had been thinking several steps ahead for longer than Leora had been tracking. She sat with Kasia, and she looked at the summons, and she thought about Ivan's shaking hands in the 3rd month, about the door he had opened knowing it might not close again, about the fact that she had told him he would only need to repeat what he knew when the time came, and the time had come, and she had not protected him from this. "When is the hearing?" she said. "Tomorrow morning," Kasia said. 1 day. Desta was still 1 day out. If Ren had reached her, if the North Pasture Gate message had gotten through, if Celine's people hadn't already picked up the Eastern Road. "I need to go to Kalen," Leora said. Kasia looked at her. "Now?" "Now." The elder's expression moved through several things quickly. "You think he'll listen?" "I think I have to try," Leora said. "Not because I believe he'll do the right thing, because if I go to him and he refuses to act and I stand in the assembly and say, I went to him first, that matters. What he does next matters." She pushed herself to her feet. The child dropped lower as she stood, a slow gravitational shift that had been happening for the last week as the body prepared for what was coming. And she registered it with the practiced sideways attention she gave all physical information now, cataloging it, deciding whether it required action. Not yet. Keep moving. Kalen was in his study. He was alone, which she had not expected, and for a moment standing in the doorway she saw something she hadn't seen in months, which was just a man at a desk looking tired. The alpha's chair, the formal colors, the carefully held authority, all of it present but slightly worn at the edges, the way things look when they've been maintained through effort rather than ease. He looked up when she came in. His face did the thing it always did now, that half second of recalibration. But this time something else moved through it underneath, something she didn't try to name because naming it would cost her focus, and she needed all of her focus. "Evan Cray's hearing," she said. She came into the room but didn't sit. "Call it off." Kalen set down what he was writing. He looked at her and she watched him choose his response with the visible care of a man who knows the next 30 seconds are going to matter. "That's a tribunal matter," he said. "It's not my—" "You're the alpha," she said. "Everything in this compound is your jurisdiction when you decide it is. You know that. Don't give me the procedural answer." "The charge is serious," he said. "If he falsified—" "He didn't falsify anything," she said. "He was ordered to, by someone inside this compound, and the tribunal that's going to rule on it tomorrow has 2 of Celine's people sitting in it." He looked at the desk. That look, the slight downward angle, the jaw working, was one she had catalogued over 6 years. It was the look of a man who already knows something and is deciding whether knowing it out loud changes his obligations. "You've been gathering things," he said. "In the archive room." "Yes," she said. "Letters. Reports." "Yes." "And you were going to present them at the assembly." "Yes," she said. "That's still what I'm going to do. But if Evan's testimony is buried under a conviction before I can get there, Kalen." She let his name land the way she used to let it land, without buffer, the direct address of someone who had once known this man all the way through. "She's running a play right now, tonight. And you know that if you let it go through, when everything comes out at the assembly, and it will come out, you'll have let it happen while you knew." The silence in the room was different from the silences in the hall. Smaller. No audience to perform for. Just 2 people who had once known each other better than this, standing in the wreckage of how they'd gotten here. "What do you have?" he said quietly. "Enough," she said. "Give me the assembly. Stop the hearing. And whatever you think of me, whatever she's told you I was going to do—" "I have the letters she used, Kalen. I have the ones with my seal on them, the ones she showed you. I had them analyzed by Harwick's predecessor, and they are not my handwriting. They were never my handwriting." He looked at her. She looked back. The letters. She had not told him about the letters because she had needed to hold them for the assembly, needed their revelation to be public and irrefutable in front of every witness that mattered. But Evan was going to be convicted tomorrow morning, and Desta might already be compromised, and the south wall was being watched, and she was standing in a room with a man who still had the authority to stop one thing before it started, and the choice was between strategy and the immediate. She had made a career of choosing strategy. For 8 months she had held the long line with both hands and not broken. She chose the immediate. She reached into her vest and took out the copy of the forged letter, the one she had held back from the cedar box, keeping it on her person because it was the thing she could least afford to lose, and set it on the desk in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at the seal. He looked at the date, which was 3 months ago, and then at the handwriting, which she had trained herself to see clearly as not hers, the slope slightly different, the letter connections too regular, the practiced imitation of someone who had studied her correspondence long enough to get close, but not long enough to get it right. He looked at it for a long time. When he looked up, his face had changed. Not dramatically. Not the collapse of a man who has seen the full truth and been broken by it. Something smaller and more devastating. The specific expression of a man who has understood that he made a decision he cannot unmake, based on information he can no longer trust, and that the cost of that decision is sitting across from him 8 months pregnant, having walked across this compound to give him one more chance. "The hearing," she said. "Stop it." He said nothing for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen and wrote 3 lines on a blank sheet. He folded it, pressed his seal ring into the wax, and set it on the desk between them. "Take it to Corin," he said. "He'll dissolve the tribunal." She looked at the sealed order. She picked it up. She did not say thank you. She did not say anything. She turned to go. "Leora." She stopped. At the assembly, he said. His voice was very quiet. Whatever you bring all of it. She left without answering. She walked down the corridor with his sealed order in one hand and the last of her copies in her vest, and the child pressing low and heavy against her pelvis with the insistent preparatory weight of something that was not going to wait much longer. And she thought, 3 days. She needed 3 days. The assembly was in 3 days, and Desta was 1 day out if Ren had gotten through, and Evan would be free by morning. She was one turn away from having everything she'd built still intact. She turned the corner toward Corin's office and found Murray standing in the corridor with 3 warriors at her back, and in Murray's hands was the cedar box. Leora stopped. The box was open. She could see the edge of the gray veil letter from where she stood. She could see the corner of Evan's affidavit. She could see the altered boundary reports fanned slightly against each other where someone had been through them and not been careful about putting them back. Maret looked at her with the gray, satisfied expression of a woman who has been waiting for this moment and found it exactly as good as she anticipated. The Alpha Consort would like these returned, she said. Leora stood in the corridor and looked at the cedar box and understood, with the specific bodily quality of understanding that bypasses language entirely, that the lock she had used twice every night for 8 months had been opened from the inside, and the only person she had brought into the archive room who could have done it was the person she had never once considered. Not Devan. Not any of Celine's cluster. Kosia, the elder who had come to her chamber at first light, who had sat across from her at the writing table, who had said, "I'll be there when you need me, I'll be there," who had known where the archive room was and what it held because Leora had told her and shown her and trusted her with the exact location of the key. The ceiling of what Leora had believed was the worst this situation could do to her turned out to have another ceiling above it. She felt the child kick, hard, the hardest kick yet, like something trying to get her attention. She looked at Mare, at the box, at the 3 warriors who were not touching her yet, but whose positioning communicated exactly what would happen if she moved toward the box instead of away from it. She looked down at the sealed order in her hand. Kalen's handwriting, Kalen's seal, dissolving the tribunal. She still had that. And she still had the letter she had not put in the cedar box because she had decided at the last moment to keep it on her person. And she still had 3 days. The choice the next 10 seconds required of her was not a choice between winning and losing. It was a choice between the woman who had built a case in the dark with great patience and the woman who needed to become something faster and harder and less careful, something that could operate without the safety of documentation and preparation and time. Everything she had built was in that box, and the box was gone. She looked at Mare for one long second, then she turned and walked in the other direction, away from Corin's office, away from the corridor, toward the outer passage that led to the compound's main gate, and she did not stop walking, and she did not look back. And in her hand was Kalen's sealed order, and in her chest was the one forged letter she had not given him yet, and in her body was a child who was running out of time at exactly the same rate she was. She had one move left. She was going to use it. She went to the haymaker's barn. Not the assembly. Not Corin's office. Not back to her chamber to regroup and recalculate. She walked out through the compound's main gate in the early dark with Kalen's sealed order in her hand and the last forged letter against her chest, and the child riding low and heavy in her pelvis with the deliberate preparatory weight of something that had already made its decision about timing, regardless of what she needed, and she walked the half-mile to the north pasture in the cold without a lantern, because a lantern could be followed. Desta was already there. She was sitting on a feed crate in the barn's dark interior with a travel pack at her feet, and the particular stillness of someone who has been moving fast for days and has learned to go completely motionless the moment she stops. She was lean and sun-darkened from the eastern border, hair cut shorter than Leora remembered, with the eyes of a woman who had been asking questions in a place that didn't want her asking them and had come out the other side knowing exactly how much that cost. She stood when Leora came through the door. "You got Ren's message," Leora said. "Last night," Desta said. "I've been here since before dark." Her eyes moved to Leora's belly with the same quick assessment Ren had made, and then moved back to her face with the focused attention of someone deciding that the belly is not the relevant information right now. What happened? They took the box, Leora said. Everything I had documented, the reports, the affidavit, the compact letter, it's gone. Desta's expression did not collapse. It hardened. The specific hardening of someone who has already been operating in loss conditions and knows how to keep moving through them. Crossia? Yes. I thought she might be. Desta reached into her travel pack. That's why I didn't come through the south wall. She pulled out a leather document roll, the kind border warriors used for orders that needed to survive weather, sealed along the edge with pressed resin, tied twice. She held it out. I've been carrying this for 3 weeks. I wasn't going to send it through any channel I didn't control personally. Leora took it. She pulled the ties and unrolled it in the barn's dark, tilting it toward the thin moonlight coming through the plank gaps in the wall. It was the transfer order, the document that had sent Desta to the eastern border 6 months ago. She had seen it at the time, or had seen what she believed was it, the version routed through Davan's office that bore Kalen's seal and the administrative language of a routine border security review. She had read it and accepted it because the seal had been correct, and because at that point she had not yet understood what Davan was. This version was different. Same date, same seal, different language in the third paragraph. The paragraph that listed the reason for the reassignment. Where the version she had seen said border security review, this version said something else entirely. 7 words that had been replaced in the routed copy before it reached her, and that in their original form said, at the request of the consort designate's office. Desta had been sent to the eastern border at Celine's request, months before Celine had any formal standing to make requests of anyone, months before the council had been told about any transition at all. Leora stood in the barn and held the document and breathed. Where did you get this? She said. The Eastern Outpost Commander, Desta said. He keeps originals of every transfer order that comes through his post, doesn't trust copies. He's been doing it for 15 years and nobody's ever asked him about it because nobody ever thought it mattered. She paused. He gave it to me when I told him what I thought it meant. He's a careful man. He doesn't do things unless he believes in them. Leora rolled the document back into its casing. She put it inside her vest with the forged letter. She stood in the barn with Desta in the dark, and the horses shifting in their stalls, and the cold coming through the wall planks, and she did something she had not done in months, which was let herself feel the full weight of where she was. Not as a strategic problem, not as a series of moves on a board, just the raw physical fact of it. 8 months pregnant, stripped of everything she'd built, standing in a barn at midnight with 1 document and 1 ally, and 3 days until an assembly that was going to determine whether her child entered this world into a pack that had already decided she didn't belong in it. The weight of it was enormous. She felt it in her chest and her throat and behind her eyes, and she let it be there for exactly as long as it took to breathe through it twice. Then she folded it away. Not because it wasn't real, because she had already done everything that weight was asking her to do, and there was nothing left in the direction of grief, only forward. What do you need from me? Desta said. Stand beside me at the assembly, Leora said, in your colors, visibly, so every person in that room knows you rode 4 days to be there. Done, Desta said. What else? The outpost commander. Will he come? He's 2 days behind me, Desta said. He started writing when I did. He didn't tell me why, just said some things needed to be said in person. Leora looked at her. He's coming to the assembly. He's coming somewhere, Desta said. I think he's been waiting for someone to ask. Tut. The assembly convened on a gray morning 3 days later in the Great Hall of Silver Ridge, and it was the largest gathering the pack had seen in a decade. Every senior warrior, every council seat, 12 elders including 2 who had traveled from outlying territories. 6 allied pack representatives who had made the journey specifically for the Luna transition ceremony. People who needed to witness a formal oath before they would recognize its legitimacy, whose presence had been arranged months in advance by Kalen's office, and whose arrival now meant that whatever happened in this hall would have witnesses that Silver Ridge's internal administrative machinery could not reach. Leora had counted on that. Had counted on it from the beginning, even before she understood everything Celine had done, because she knew that Celine needed the assembly for exactly the same reason, Public legitimacy before witnesses that couldn't be managed afterward. The assembly was a trap for both of them. The question was which one of them had more truth on their side when the trap closed. She came in through the main doors with Desta behind her and the outpost commander, a blunt, weathered man named Aldrich, who had the bearing of someone who has spent 15 years being correct and unlistened to and has consequently run out of patience for anything that wastes his time, walking at her left. The room saw her. She felt the seeing of it, the collective shift of attention, the recalibration of 50 or 60 people who had been told one story and were now looking at a piece of information that didn't fit it. An 8 months pregnant Luna walking into a formal assembly with a border warrior and a man nobody recognized wearing the insignia of the Eastern Outpost Command. Kalen was already at the head. He looked at her when she came in and his face did something she hadn't seen it do in months, which was go uncertain. Not guilty. Uncertain. The face of a man standing on ground he has been told is solid and is now feeling move. Celine was to his right. She was dressed in the Luna's blue-gray. Not ivory, not somewhere between, but the actual colors, worn for the first time as a statement of possession. She saw Leora, and she saw Desta, and she saw Aldrich, and the calculation that moved through her eyes was swift and precise and revealed nothing except that it was happening. Maret was at the edge of the room. She saw Leora look at her, and she looked away. Leora walked to her seat. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the table, the same way she had done on the first morning, and she waited. Kalen opened the assembly. Formal language, the ritual opening of a Silver Ridge gathering that she had heard 20 times in 6 years, and she let it move past her like water while she breathed and kept her eyes level and felt Desta solid at her left and Aldrich 3 feet behind her right shoulder. The formal oath was the third item on the agenda. Standard procedure. Administrative business first, then the significant announcements, then the oaths that required witness. Leora listened to the first 2 items with the flat, precise attention of someone counting down. She tracked Celine's stillness across the table. She tracked the allied representatives, 6 of them, positioned along the east wall, none of whom had any stake in Silver Ridge's internal politics, and all of whom had been brought here to be witnesses, which meant every word said in this room from this point forward was being evaluated by people who did not owe anything to anyone present. That was the fulcrum. That was always the fulcrum. Kalen reached the third item. Silver Ridge convenes today to formalize the appointment of a new Luna, he said. In accordance with pack law, this appointment requires full council acknowledgement and allied witness. He looked at the assembled room. Celine Voss will take the Luna's oath before this assembly. Leora stood up. The room went very quiet. She had planned to wait, had planned to let Celine step forward, let the oath begin, and interrupt at the moment of maximum witness visibility. But Celine was already moving, and the allied representatives were leaning slightly forward, and she understood that if Celine's hand touched the oath stone, she needed to be on her feet before it did. So she was on her feet. I have information this assembly needs to hear before any oath is administered, she said. Her voice filled the room the way she had trained it to fill rooms, clear, level, built for exactly this kind of space, not loud, carrying. Kalen said, Leora. Alpha, she said. And she used the title, not his name, because the title was the relevant address in a formal assembly, and the allied representatives would hear that and know she was conducting herself procedurally. Pack law gives any standing member of this council the right to present evidence before a formal transition oath is completed. I'm invoking that right. Now. A silence. She counted 3 seconds of it, and then Aldrich's voice behind her, flat and carrying. I'll second the invocation. Eastern Outpost Command, Silver Ridge Pack. The allied representatives looked at each other. One of them, a gray-bearded man from the Thornwood contingent who had the bored, focused attention of someone who has seen a lot of pack assemblies and is paying close attention to this one, straightened very slightly. Kalen said nothing. His hands were flat on the table. He looked at her, and she looked back, and she watched him make the decision. The only decision he could make in front of 6 allied witnesses without making the situation dramatically worse, which was to sit back and let her speak. Proceed, he said. She reached into her vest. She set the forged letter on the table first. She set Aldrich's transfer order beside it. She looked at the room. "The letter on the left bears my seal," she said. "It was used to convince multiple members of this council that I intended to abandon Silver Ridge after giving birth. It was used to justify this transition and the removal of my authority over pack business. It is a forgery." She looked at the Allied representatives directly. "I had it examined. The handwriting is not mine. The seal was lifted from a legitimate document I signed 14 months ago and transferred to this one. I have testimony to that effect from a document analyst in Greyville." The room didn't break into noise. It did something worse, which was stay quiet with a quality of attention that meant everyone in it was doing very fast individual calculations. The document on the right is the original transfer order that sent Council Member Desta, my senior associate and the longest-serving warrior liaison in Silver Ridge's eastern operation, to the border 6 months ago. She looked at Kaylin. "The version of this order that was routed through your office said she was sent for a border security review. The original, kept at the eastern outpost as standard command protocol, says something different. It says she was sent at the request of the consort designate's office." She paused. 6 months ago, there was no consort designate. There was no formal proposal. The transition that was publicly announced to this council 3 weeks ago was being operationally executed 6 months prior by someone who was already using pack resources and pack authority she had not been given. Selene said, "Those documents—" "I'm not finished," Leora said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "Yvonne Cray," she said. "Border warrior, 3rd Eastern Rotation. He was ordered by a member of this compound to file falsified contact reports describing non-existent interactions between myself and Eastern Patrol personnel. Reports that were then used to build a case to this council that I was actively working against pack interests." She looked at Aldrich. "Commander?" Aldrich stepped forward. He had the particular presence of a man who has been factual his entire career and expects to continue being factual regardless of who is in the room. "Yvonne Cray filed his falsified reports through my outpost," he said. "He came to me 6 weeks ago and told me what he'd been ordered to do and who had ordered it. I have his written statement. I also have the original unaltered contact reports that he replaced. The dates and content are inconsistent in ways that are not explainable by anything other than deliberate falsification." He set a document on the table. The gray-bearded Thornwood representative looked at it. He looked at the transfer order. He looked at the forged letter. His expression was that of a man assembling furniture from pieces that only fit together one way. Kaylin had gone very still. Leora looked at him, at the man she had known for 6 years, who was sitting at the head of his own council with his hands flat on the table and his face carrying an expression she had no word for. Not guilt, not rage, something underneath both of them, the specific devastation of a man who has understood all at once that he was not deceived casually, but systematically, with precision, by someone who had studied him long enough to know exactly which levers to pull. She did not feel satisfaction about that. She felt the distant, cold recognition of someone who has been right about a terrible thing and gets nothing from being right except the confirmation. Celine's voice cut through the silence. "This is a performance," she said, and her voice was still controlled, still level, but something in it had lost the warmth entirely, and what was underneath was the voice Leora had heard in the corridor the morning after the council announcement, the flat, certain voice of a woman who has decided on a course and will not leave it. A frightened woman's performance, 3 weeks overdue. She had months to bring any of this forward, and she chose to wait until a formal assembly to stage a scene. "I waited," Leora said, "because everything I had was in a locked box in a room only I had access to, and it was taken 3 nights ago by someone inside this compound." She looked at the room. "I'd like to know who gave the order for that. I'd like that asked and answered in front of these witnesses." The room looked at Kaylin. Kaylin looked at Selene. And in that look, the half-second of it, the reflexive turning of his face toward hers even now, even here, the room saw everything it needed to see about how this had happened and how long it had been happening. Selene looked back at him with the gray, steady eyes of a woman who is prepared for this exact moment and is deciding which version of prepared she needs to be. Then she looked at the room, at the Allied representatives, at the 12 elders, at the warriors who had been her audience for months, and were now an audience of a different kind. And something in her face made a small, nearly invisible adjustment, the look of a player recalculating its speed, assessing what could still be salvaged, what version of this outcome was least catastrophic. She said, "I acted to protect this pack." It was the wrong choice of words. Leora knew it the moment Celine said them, and she could see from the slight change in the Thornwood representative's posture that he knew it too. Because protecting the pack was a justification, and justifications only became necessary when what had been done required justifying, and Celine had just told the room she believed she needed one. "From what?" said Elder Harwick, old Harwick, who had been giving Celine whatever she asked for since the second month, and who was now sitting with his hands folded and his voice carrying the particular tone of a man trying to find out whether there is ground beneath him before he takes another step. "What were you protecting us from?" Celine looked at him. "From a Luna who was going to leave, who had already decided to go back to her birth pack, who—" "There are no letters," Aldrich said. "We have examined correspondence records from the birth pack contact. There is no request. There is no arrangement. There is no evidence that she was going anywhere." Silence. "The letters you were shown," Desta said from behind Leora's left shoulder, and her voice was the flat, certain voice of someone who has had days on the road to distill what she knows into its simplest form, "were made to be shown. They were made specifically to tell the people you needed to convince exactly what you needed them to believe. That's not protection. That's architecture." The word fell into the room and sat there. Celine opened her mouth. Kaelin said, "Don't." One word. Quiet enough that half the room almost didn't hear it. But Celine heard it and Leora heard it, and the quality of the silence that followed was the quality of a room that has just watched a structure collapse from the inside and is still processing the sound of it. Kaelin stood up. He looked at the allied representatives. He looked at the 12 elders. He looked at the warriors along the wall, some of whom had been in Celine's orbit for months, and some of whom were now standing with the careful stillness of people trying to figure out how much of what they did in the last 6 months is going to matter in the next 10 minutes. He looked at Leora last. The look lasted 3 seconds. She held it without flinching and without warmth and without anything he could reach in her, and she watched him understand that. "The oath will not proceed today," he said. His voice was the Alpha's voice, formal, carrying, the voice that was built for this room. "This council will convene a full review of the evidence presented. Allied witnesses are invited to remain as observers." He looked at the assembled room. "This assembly is in recess." Celine said, "Kaelin." He turned to look at her. She looked back at him with those gray eyes, and in them was the last calculation. The look of a woman assessing whether there was still a version of this that could be redirected, whether the man she had spent months studying and maneuvering still had a lever she could reach. She found nothing. She looked away first. The room began to move. Voices, the sound of chairs, the particular charged energy of a large group of people processing the same information at different speeds and with different stakes. Leora stood at her place at the council table, and she did not move until the motion around her had settled into something navigable, and then she looked at Desta. Desta looked back at her. No words. The look of someone who has ridden 4 days through cold country to stand in a room and do a thing and has done it. Then Leora felt the pain. It started low, not the rolling pressure she had been living with for weeks, but something sharper and more specific, a clenching that began at the base of her spine and moved forward and downward and held. And her hand went to the edge of the table, and she gripped it, and she breathed through it with the focused animal attention of someone who has been told what this feeling means and knows exactly what it means. The child had been listening. 8 months of listening, and it had chosen this exact room, this exact moment, the assembly recess, and the testimony delivered, and the oath stopped, and the structure of what had been done beginning to come apart under the weight of what was true. Desta's hand was on her arm. "Leora." "I need to sit down," Leora said. Her voice was perfectly steady. She was very proud of that. "You need more than that," Desta said. "I know," she said. "In a minute." She looked at the head of the table, at Kaelin, who was speaking to Harwick in the low, controlled tone of a man managing the immediate and trying not to look at what the immediate is sitting on top of. He had not looked at her since the assembly went into recess. She did not know if he would. She looked at the allied representatives, two of whom were speaking to each other with the focused, deliberate energy of people who will be filing a report when they get home and want to get the sequence of events exactly right. She looked at the place where Celine had been standing. Celine was gone. The chair was empty, the space where she had been standing was empty, and the door at the far end of the hall was slightly ajar, in the way of a door that has been opened recently and closed quickly by someone who did not want the closing to draw attention. Leora looked at that door for a long moment. Another wave of pain moved through her, longer this time, more certain, the body making its position entirely clear. Desta said her name again, low and urgent. "Get me out of the main hall," Leora said, "before anyone else sees this." They moved. Desta's arm under hers, Aldrich clearing the path in front of them with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to moving through crowds on business, the three of them crossing the hall's edge toward the side corridor, while behind them the assembly churned and the council began to reassemble for a review that was going to take this pack apart piece by piece and see what it was actually made of. At the door, Leora paused. She looked back at the hall one time, at the table where she had sat for 6 years, and the chair at its head where Kalen was now standing with his hands pressed flat against the wood, and she understood that the thing she had built with 8 months of careful work in the dark was now out in the light and doing what she had built it to do, and that she was going to have to walk out of this room before she found out how it ended. The third wave hit harder. She gripped the door frame. "Now," Desta said. "Now," Leora agreed. They went. The boy came into the world at 3 a.m. No ceremony to it. No witnesses except Desta and a midwife named Brell, who had been delivering Silver Ridge's children for 20 years and who worked with the efficient, unhurried competence of someone who has seen enough of the hardest moments of human life that she no longer confuses urgency with panic. The room they used was one of the lower guest chambers. Small, warm, close to the ground. Nothing like the Luna's suite where Leora had imagined this happening in the months when she had still been imagining things the way she planned them. It took 6 hours. The kind of labor that does not allow for anything else. Not thought, not strategy, not the careful management of what her face showed. Just the body doing the most animal thing a body can do. Stripping every constructed layer away until there was nothing left except the fundamental fact of it. A woman, a child, the hard work of bringing one into the world that the other was already in. When it was over, Brell set the boy on Leora's chest, and he was warm and furious and entirely himself, screaming at the indignity of arrival with the full-throated outrage of someone who had strong opinions about everything and intended to express them. Leora put her hand on his back. She felt his heartbeat against her palm. Fast, fierce, completely certain of itself. She said nothing for a long time. Desta was in the chair by the wall, arms crossed, face doing the particular thing it did when she was moved, and did not want to perform being moved. Her eyes were bright. She looked at the wall. "What will you call him?" she said to the wall. Leora looked at the child, at the dark hair, already present, the clenched fist that had been pressing against her ribs for months, now free and working against the air with the furious energy of something that had always intended to make itself known. "Kale," she said. "Not after the runner, after the idea of him. The person who carries what needs carrying across the distance between what is and what should be, who shows up travel-dusty and road-worn and does it anyway." Desta looked at her, nodded once, then went back to looking at the wall before her face could do anything else. The council's review took 11 days. Leora was not present for most of it. She was in the lower guest chamber with her son, learning the particular consuming work of a newborn, the feeding schedules, the weight of him asleep on her chest, the way he smelled of something she had no word for, clean and specific and entirely his. She received daily reports from Desta, who attended the review sessions and came back each evening with the flat, methodical account of someone who takes notes and reads them back accurately without editorializing. On the 3rd day, Celine was formally summoned to appear. On the 4th day, under the weight of Aldrich's testimony and the transfer order and the document analyst's report from Greyville, that Cassia, in what Leora suspected was the only genuine act of conscience she had managed through the entire affair, had not destroyed along with the rest of the cedar box's contents, Celine confessed. Not completely, not cleanly. It came out in pieces, the way these things always come out. A partial admission here, a qualification there, a version of events that tried to preserve the appearance of justified action, even while acknowledging the specific facts that could no longer be denied. But the shape of it was clear and it was damning, and the allied representatives who had stayed, who were still present on the fourth and fifth and sixth days with the patient, thorough attention of people who understood that what they witnessed here would follow them home and become part of the record of how this territory conducted itself, heard all of it. On the seventh day, Kosia appeared before the review and tendered her resignation from the council. She did not confess to anything except the box. She said she had been asked to provide access and had done so. She said she had believed she was acting in the pack's interest. She said she understood that this was insufficient. Leora heard this from Desta and sat with it for a long time. She thought about what it cost a person to do what Kosia had done. Not the act itself, but the architecture of self-justification required to do it. The story you have to tell yourself. The incremental steps from I'm managing this situation to I'm helping the right outcome happen to I'm opening a lock in a room while a woman is sleeping 30 feet away who trusted me with the key. Each step small enough to take. Each step making the next one easier. Until you are, without ever deciding to become this, the person who did the thing. She thought about all the small steps she herself had taken over 8 months, every calculated silence, every withheld piece of information, every moment she had chosen strategy over confrontation and told herself it was wisdom. The line between Kasia's choices and her own was not as thick as she wanted it to be. She knew that. She sat with it honestly because sitting with things honestly was the only practice she had left that she fully trusted. The difference, she decided, was not in the nature of the calculation. It was in what the calculation served. And that was the thing you had to be willing to examine without flinching. Not whether you were strategic, but whether your strategy was pointed towards something true. She held her son and thought about this for a long time. She did not arrive at comfortable conclusions. She arrived at workable ones, which was not the same thing, but was what the situation offered. Kaelin came to her on the 9th day. She had known he would, had known it with the specific certainty of someone who has spent 6 years reading a person and despite everything, still reads them correctly. He came in the late afternoon when the light was going flat and gold through the window and Kael was asleep against her shoulder, and he stood in the doorway for a moment the way he had stood in rooms for 6 years, filling them with his presence without quite deciding whether to come all the way in. She looked at him. He looked at her and then at the child, and something moved through his face that she did not try to catalog because it was private in a way that even now, after everything, she did not feel she had the right to read. "Can I come in?" he said. "Yes," she said. He came in. He did not sit. He stood near the window and looked at his son sleeping against her shoulder with the slightly stunned expression of a man confronting a reality that has become more real than he was prepared for. "He's bigger than I expected," he said. "He's been growing for 9 months," she said. He almost smiled. It didn't reach his eyes, and she wasn't sure it was supposed to. He looked at her. "Leora," he said, and stopped. She waited. "There isn't a version of what I can say," he said, "that gets anywhere close to what I did. I know that. I'm not here to tell you I have the words." His jaw worked. "I'm here because he's my son, and you're sitting in a guest room of a house that should have been yours for the next 30 years, and I put you there, and I need to say that. Out loud. To your face." She looked at him. At the man she had loved, which she had not stopped doing cleanly, and all at once the way you stop doing things you've decided to stop, but had stopped doing in increments, each one costing something, until what remained was not love, in the sense she had once understood it, but something more like the exhausted recognition of a person she had known fully and would carry the knowledge of forever whether she wanted to or not. "I believe you," she said. "That you mean it." "But," he said. "There's no but," she said. "I believe you. That's not the same as it being enough." He nodded. He looked at Kael. "What do you need?" he said. "For him, for yourself. Whatever you need, I'll do it." She thought about this. Not because she hadn't thought about it before, she had been thinking about it since the 6th month, the quiet preparation of a woman who had understood early that she might be making decisions about the future alone. But because the question deserved a real answer and she wanted to give him one. "I need him to know this pack," she said. "His pack. I need him to grow up inside it, not in exile from it. I need the council to stabilize and the eastern border to be properly staffed, and the Greyvale Compact to receive an official communication from Silver Ridge's Alpha, acknowledging the back-channel approaches that were made without authorization." "Done," he said. "All of it." "And I need you to understand," she said, and her voice stayed level, "that I'm not coming back to you. Not as Luna beside you. Not as your mate. What was between us? I can't rebuild it on the same ground. The ground changed. I need you to understand that without making it a negotiation." He looked at her for a long time. His face had the expression of a man absorbing something he already knew and finding that knowing it in advance did not make it easier to receive. "I understand," he said. "Good," she said. He looked at his son one more time, then he looked at her. "He has your jaw," he said. Quiet. Almost to himself. She looked down at the child, at the sleeping face, the clenched hands, the complete unconscious certainty of new life. "He has his own jaw," she said. "He just got here." Kaylin left. She sat in the quiet room and held her son, and the light went flat and then gray and then dark. And she did not call for a lamp for a while because the dark was not uncomfortable, and Kale slept through it without complaint, which she took as a professional assessment from someone with no stake in performing anything. The council's formal ruling came on the 11th day. Celine Voss was permanently exiled from Silver Ridge territory and all allied lands under the Greyvale Compact's jurisdiction. The ruling was unanimous. The allied representatives signed as witnesses. Murray resigned her advisory seat and was given 30 days to vacate the compound. The warrior Captain Goss was demoted and reassigned to the outer eastern rotation, not as punishment exactly, but as the kind of consequence that follows from having aligned yourself with a thing that turned out to be wrong. Kaylin's authority was formally reviewed and partially suspended, not removed because the pack needed function and because the Allied representatives had made clear that a full leadership vacuum in a border territory served no one's interests but constrained. A council oversight structure was established that required majority approval for any significant personnel or territorial decisions. He accepted it without contest. Leora was present for the announcement. She sat in her council seat, her seat, the one at the Alpha's left that had been hers for 6 years, and that she had not vacated by choice, and that therefore remained under pack law legitimately hers until she chose otherwise, with Kale in a wrap against her chest and Desta at her left, and Aldrich, who had stayed, who had said when she thanked him that he had come because things needed saying and had stayed because things needed witnessing, standing at the room's edge with his arms crossed and his face expressing nothing except the flinty satisfaction of a man whose 15 years of careful record-keeping had finally mattered. She listened to the ruling. She watched the faces in the room receive it, the relief in some, the discomfort in others, the particular careful blankness of people who had spent the last several months on the wrong side of something and were now recalibrating what they were willing to say out loud about that. She did not feel triumphant. She had expected to, and she did not. What she felt was tired. The deep, bone-level tiredness of someone who has carried something for a very long time and has now set it down. And the setting down is relief. But the body takes a while to understand that it can stop holding the tension that carrying required. She felt that. And underneath it, quieter, the first tentative shape of something she didn't have a name for yet. Not happiness exactly, not victory, something more like the future, arriving. 3 months later, the council voted. Not because it was required, the council's oversight structure gave them authority to appoint advisors and administrative leads, but did not mandate a formal Luna appointment while the pack remained in transition. They voted because Desta proposed it, and Kasia's former seat had been filled by a woman named Tev, who had 17 years of border law experience and a brisk practical intelligence that cut through procedural delay like a hand through smoke. And Tev seconded it, and Elder Harwick, Old Harwick, who had made the worst calculation of his career and was spending the rest of it trying to make up the distance, voted yes before anyone else could speak. It was unanimous. Leora was in the archive room when Desta came to tell her. She had rebuilt it. Not the cedar box, not the documentation of threats and falsifications, but the actual work, the boundary reports and council records and administrative correspondence that had been her real function for 6 years and that she had never stopped doing even when her authority to do it had been stripped away, because the work was the work, and it needed doing, regardless of who was officially permitted to do it. She set down the report she was reviewing. She looked at Desta. Desta said, "It was unanimous." Leora looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the archive room, the shelves of records, the smell of cold stone and old paper that she had spent 8 months learning to think in, the place where she had built something in the dark with her hands and her patience and the stubborn, unglamorous refusal to stop. "Tell them I'll be there in an hour," she said. "They can wait longer if—" "An hour is enough," she said. She went to find Cale first. He was with Ren. Ren, who had ridden out in the middle of the night on a gray horse for a woman who had told her the truth about risk, and who had been given Desta's old administrative assistant position with the brisk practicality of someone who understood that people who act well under pressure are exactly the people you want close. And she picked him up and held him for a few minutes in the small room that had been his home since he arrived, looking at his face. He was 3 months old and had developed a very serious expression when he was paying attention to something, the concentrated look of a person receiving information he intends to do something with. He looked at her face now with that expression, and she looked back at him. "We're going in," she told him. He grabbed her finger with his whole hand. That was all. That was enough. She carried him into the main hall. The council stood when she came in, not in the performed ceremony of formal appointment. That would come later, with the allied witnesses and the oath and the administrative record. This was something else, something the standing expressed without anyone deciding to express it. An acknowledgement from people who had spent months calculating which way the weight would fall, and who understood now what it had cost to be the person who held it. She walked to the head of the table. Not the Alpha's chair. That was Kalen's, and she had no interest in it. The Luna's seat at his left, which she had never stopped occupying in anything except the formal record. She sat down. She put Cale in the wrap against her chest. He looked at the room with his serious face. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at the assembled council, at Desta and Tev and Harwick, and the faces of the people who remained, some of whom had been here for the long fall of the last year, and some of whom were new, brought in as the structure rebuilt itself around the absence of what Celine had built, and the absence of the things Kalen had allowed. And she thought about what it had taken to get to this table. Not the strategy, not the documents, the testimony, the careful construction of a case in the dark. Those were the means, and the means had mattered, but they were not the thing itself. The thing itself was simpler and harder than any of that. It was the decision, made and remade every morning for 8 months, not to become the version of herself that the situation seemed to require. Not the version that hardened into armor. Not the version that shrank into silence. Not the version that stopped believing the work was worth doing just because the work kept being taken from her. She had made that decision in increments, without drama, in cold rooms before dawn, and it had not felt like strength while she was doing it. It had felt like stubbornness, like exhaustion, like the blunt refusal of a woman who had run out of alternatives and so kept going simply because stopping was the only thing that would make everything that had already cost so much cost more. She understood now that this was what it was, not the absence of fear, not immunity to loss, just the decision, over and over, to stay with what was true. She looked at the table. "All right," she said. "Where are we on the Eastern Boundary reports?" Tev slid the document across the table with a slight dry smile. "Behind," she said. 3 weeks. "Let's start there," Leora said. The meeting began. Kael slept through most of it with the serene confidence of someone who had chosen his moment to arrive and found it satisfactory. Outside the hall's high windows, the light was clean and cold, the particular sharp clarity of a morning that had decided to be bright about it, that had no interest in the atmospheric weight of what had happened in this room or the rooms near it. That was simply the next morning arriving as mornings do, indifferent to the human architecture of what they follow. Silver Ridge had its Luna. She had work to do. She did it.